Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. Your webinar is over. Now what? Thinking beyond the live event. Thanks for joining us. My name is Dallas Jessup, and I'm the manager of the BrightTALK Academy, and I will be your moderator for today's session. Now, today we are joined by Ken Molay, which I'm really excited for him to share some of his great tips within. He's been an expert within the webinar industry for a couple decades now. He has spent many years in high-tech marketing with product marketing and other forms of tech marketing, and now has been working at Webinar Success as the founder and president to help companies really maximize the effectiveness of their online webinar conferences. So he does speaking training, event organization, on-air support, and lead generation management. So very skilled professional with us today, so happy to have him share his skills. So I'll let him introduce himself in just a second, but wanted to cover a few quick notes about the presentation and the BrightTALK platform. So today's webinar will be available on demand after we wrap up, and for you who are new to BrightTALK, the link will be exactly the same as the one you registered for, so feel free to share that link directly or use the social icons at the bottom of your screen. Now, we've also added some attachments. You can find today's briefing document as well as some blog posts, including webinars and other related content. Now, if you have a question at any time during the presentation, please use the Asking the Ask a Questions tab. We'll be answering questions throughout the session and at the end of the session as well. And if we don't get to your question today, we'll make sure to follow up with you afterwards. So without further ado, over to you, Ken.
Oh, I don't know, Dallas. Let's have a little ado. Okay. All right, thank you. I think that we should just jump into content. You came here for a reason, which is getting more return on the investment that you're already putting into your webinars. Hopefully, if you're doing a good webinar, you are spending a fair amount of time, a fair amount of effort on making sure you're going to have good content, that you're putting on something that people want to hear. Why should that be limited just to the people who can make it to that one online session? You need to reach additional audiences who didn't make it to the live online session. And for the people who did show up, you want to make better use of your webinar resources to continue furthering your business objectives. And that's what we're going to talk about. I've broken this into a number of different specific sub areas, and I'm going to talk about why I did it this way. So you're going to get a little example as we go along. And I hope that you will use that questions button there to type in your questions as we go. I'm keeping an eye on that. We're not just going to save everything until the very end. I hate it when there's no interaction through the course of this. So let's get started on specifics and tips. What's the easiest thing to do after a webinar is over? You make the full webinar recording available on demand. And maybe you also distribute your PowerPoint slides that were used in the session. I would guess most companies probably never go beyond those basic follow-ups. And even if you do, I think too many webinar administrators don't track the statistics on how many views they're getting on those recordings or how many downloads those resources are getting. Different technologies allow different kinds of reporting metrics, but I'd urge you to find a way to get reports on your viewing performance over time for all of your online resources, whether those are recording links or whether those are downloads that you're making available. If your technology allows it, that's great. Use those reports. If your technology doesn't have it built in, then you should probably find a way to do that. There are a lot of ways to track things that are happening on the web. So we can always look for that. And this is a good time to do a quick little poll. Let's find out, just in our mini audience here today, how prevalent this is. I'm going to open up a poll and just ask you, on your webinars, do you track views of recordings and downloads of archived content going forward afterwards? Whether that's rarely, never for you, whether it's always, frequently, or somewhere in the middle, or you're not sure, it's not applicable, you haven't started doing webinars, you don't make anything available afterwards. We'll take a look at those votes together. And Dallas, I'm just going to check and make sure, is your line open right now? It sounds like I'm hearing just a little bit of background noise.
I was on mute, but I'm here.
Okay. All righty. Fair enough. Hopefully my voice is coming through.
So, I think this would be an interesting question for you as well, since, you typically speak on behalf of clients and partners and customers. Do you find it important to track views and downloads from, being a presenter versus a hosting type of perspective?
I think it's incredibly important, and I think it's not as common and prevalent as it should be. So let's take a look at this poll. I'm going to stop the voting and see if we can't see results. It looks to me like 45% of our respondents said always and frequently. That's great. That's better than I thought. And I think that might be influenced by the fact of who came to this webinar, who would be interested in this subject. Tends to be people who are better at best practices for webinars. So kudos to you. If you said sometimes or rarely or never, look what's happening. Your competitors out there are getting more information than you have, and they're able to find out what's working and what's not. Why is this important? Well, let me show you something that I stole from the BrightTALK Webinar Benchmarks report for this year. They looked at all of the content on their site over the past year, and the way to interpret this chart is over the total number of views that ever happen on a recording, how many of those occur during the first 10 days or the first 20 days. So if you look down at the bottom, it says, yeah, sure, there's a bump. About a third of your people are going to see the recording, are going to watch that recording within 10 days after the live event. But read all the way up to the top. After 3 months have gone by, you still have about 35, 36% of the people who are going to watch the recording yet to watch it. What does that tell you? If you're making an assumption that recordings only have value for a short time after your webinar and that naturally you can expect them to kind of dwindle off in popularity, you're thinking the wrong way. You need to think about extending the usefulness, extending the lifespan of your recordings and make them available for a longer period. So let's talk about how to do that. How can you be effective in promoting a recording? One of the things that I just wrote a blog post about was promoting one thing at a time. If you tell people there is a recording available that can give you valuable information on how to maximize your ROI, people will say, yeah, that's something I'm interested in. I'm going to click on that and play it. Compare that to, we have a lot of content on our site. You should go and take a look at our library of resources and see if any of them are interesting to you. Wow, what's the value proposition in that sentence? Why would they want to go and do that? It's just maybe if you spend some time looking through stuff, you might find something interesting for you. That's never going to be as powerful. So think about what's happening with your call to action. Promote do this one thing. Here's some value for you, and you can use that properly. What else happens? If you are putting on a live event, you can reference a past webinar, a recording in that event. So for instance, in this one, let me give you another example. Be practical about this. If you're interested in what I'm talking about in terms of how to market your webinars right, you might also be interested in how to use personas to do that more effectively. And you can find that on BrightTALK in a presentation that I gave a while back. There's a recording available. All you have to do is go to BrightTALK and put into the search area my name, Molay, and it'll come right up there. And you can find additional information that will give you additional value. So that's a nice thing to be able to do, to be able to reference past value in terms of what you're getting now in the value that's being presented. And as you do this promotion and marketing of your recordings, you should think about it the same way that you would promote and market a live upcoming webinar. You don't have to do anything differently. You indicate who's the target audience, who's going to most directly benefit from the information presented in that recording. Tell people you will learn, you will hear, you will discover, you will see all those promises of things that they will get by watching the recording. It doesn't have to be different than your initial message. Sometimes a message just doesn't hit people in the marketing world when they're ready to be influenced by it. So you give them the opportunity again to come in with the same promotional effort, and this time instead of an upcoming webinar, you're giving that same promotional effort on a recorded webinar. And that's going to give you a way to deal with this information and hit people again when it's going to be most valuable to them. Dallas, let me do a quick check in with you and see if there's any questions as we're going through this promotion and ideas of using past webinars that we should talk about right now.
Yeah, sure. There's a couple. So let's go with this one first about, would the performance of my webinar be more attributed to filters applied to a campaign, so i.e. limiting the reach and thus omitting responses, the messaging, or both? So I guess, kind of what's been your experience in terms of the success of the webinar, both, live and on demand?
Yeah, I think you can get as much response and effectiveness from both pieces of it, the live and the on-demand. I think a part of that question might also be about the size of the funnel. Do you want to limit your reach, which would cut out responses from potential people? Yes, I believe in that. I say cut down the people you're trying to reach so that you say this is only correct and valuable for a limited subset of the audience. That goes against what a lot of marketers want to do. Always keep that funnel opening as big as possible at the beginning, because you're always going to have a set abandonment rate as you go down the line. I think what you're doing is creating more people who come to you and then are dissatisfied. And I never want to start by reaching as many dissatisfied people as possible in my company. So yes, cut down your reach. Be more effective at hitting a higher quality return for yourself, and that's going to potentially give you better results coming in.
Great. And I think you definitely hit a very strategic point on there. Is it's just kind of what is the goal for your webinar? If you're trying to do a very top of funnel content to bring a whole bunch of people into your funnel, certainly limiting, your reach based off of titles or company size or all of those type of things will certainly minimize your audience. But as you go further along through the content, more relevant content to the most relevant people is definitely important. So number of people attending, number of people engaging isn't always the most important thing. It's how many of those people actually convert into customers, and then continuously renew every year. So I think there's a lot of, kind of considering where you are within your webinar program. So let's do one more question before we jump into the next section. And that's, I think you'll go into a little bit of this before, but perhaps we can touch base on it just a little now is, how many repurposed assets should I be creating from a webinar? What's too much?
I don't think there is too much. You can create a lot of different assets and use them in interesting ways, and I am going to talk about that and be very specific. So hold on to that thought, and we're going to hit that one. It gives me an opportunity to move into my next section. So let me work on this piece, and we'll hold that one in reserve for a little later.
Perfect.
Let's assume that you have a pretty good handle on the classic hold a live event, record the whole thing, post the recording approach to working with your audience. That's your classic way of thinking about how you're going to deal with your audience. What are ways that you can do things afterwards to extend the interactive element of your webinar? And I'm going to talk about things you can do with a secondary webinar. So after your webinar, can you hold another webinar that's going to have additional value? It can if there's more interaction, more dialogue. Let's, again, get very specific and use examples. Back a million years ago when I went to college, before web conferencing existed, our professors would give lectures in the lecture hall, and then they would hold office hours and say, you can come and ask additional questions. Nowadays, they probably do all of that on web conferencing. But the idea is still a great one. What if your initial lecture, your presentation as a webinar, is giving the information to your attendees? It gives them tips and advice and tells them things that they want to know. Then there's a limited amount of interaction you can have, but what you want to do is say, we're going to give you the opportunity to come back and ask additional questions, think about this some more, drill into subjects you thought went by too quickly. You can do that with the original lecturer, or maybe you had a guest speaker. You can use a teacher's aide, one of your subject matter experts internally, a sales engineer who can talk about some of these things. And this gives people a chance to do more of that interaction than they could in the initial session. Another great advantage of this is that it gives you a reason to contact people again and say, hey, did you miss the initial session? You still have a chance to do live interaction and get your questions answered. Just go back, watch the recording of the initial lecture, and then you can come to our office hours session and get your questions answered. It's a way to get double duty out of your initial presentation. And a variation on the theme is a great one if, as we're doing with this webinar, you have what's known as a moderated or a privatized QA session. So you can't see what other people are typing as their questions. A lot of times folks will say, I'd like to find out what other people asked and what your answers are because I learned from that. So instead of just publishing an FAQ paper, why not use that question log from your first webinar as a starting point for a follow-up webinar? And then you can introduce each question on a simple slide by itself. You talk through your answers. You can spend more time, deal with subtleties and contingencies in your answer that just wouldn't be practical if you wrote out everything. And everybody gets to learn from that Q&A that came in after the first one. If you still want to turn that into a printed FAQ, really easy to do. You can take the entire audio line from that second webinar and have a transcript made of it. So it's a great way to get more information out there. Dallas, time to check in with you again.
Certainly. So I know there's a lot of questions about this whole Q&A concept. So let me try to synthesize a couple of them into larger is, I think the first question is, you kind of talked about it, about sourcing the questions for the office hours, but perhaps you could go into a little bit more depth about that?
Absolutely. There are a couple of ways to do that. First, of course, is just saying we're going to make it an open session. You don't have to sit there and watch a bunch of presentation slides go by. Come with your questions, ask them, and we're going to answer them right there live on the air. So the people that show up are people that have questions. You're going to source them in the session. But you can also ask for questions ahead of time. So you can say, when you register for this, write on the registration form, type in a question that you have for us. Or you can say, send us an email afterwards to this account, and we're collecting those, and that's what we'll do. Or if you have some additional web skills, build a web form and ask for questions that way. So you can source questions from your registrants before the webinar ever starts. And then the second part of that was the second slide that I showed, which was sourcing the questions that you'll talk about from the questions that were typed in the initial webinar that maybe you didn't have a chance to get to on the air. So that gives you additional pieces as well.
Great. So I have a feeling I already know your answer to this question based off of our prior conversations. But essentially, I think the question is around, do you find the Q&A from a webinar more valuable to repurpose into another webinar or to a blog post? Is there really, our audience member wants to know, is that really enough content to quantify doing another webinar?
Oh, only you can tell. If there's enough interest, then yes, it is. If there's not enough interest, then no, there's not. Take a look at what it looks like to you. I can't tell you. All of these tips are things that will work in certain cases. And I'm going to come back to that concept at the very end. I promise to tie back to that. But you pick and choose the things that are going to work best for your needs. For instance, let's move into another section and talk about another idea. Here we have the idea of remaking your content for other cultures. And right now, Dallas is grimacing in the background. She and I had this talk about, is it remaking it for other geographies? Is it remaking it for other cultures? Is it remaking it for other languages? Well, let's talk about that. If you work in Canada, you need to make your content available for French speakers and for English speakers. And a lot of Canadians will feel that they really belong to a different cultural identity that's based around the language they speak. If you were doing a webinar for local audiences in Los Angeles, you might very well have an English language webinar and a separate Spanish language webinar because there's such a large Spanish-speaking population. If you're in Europe, you've got all those different languages to deal with. Heck, in Switzerland, you've got German, English, and Italian, and they identify often by language and by cultural subdivision. So whatever it is, don't overlook the opportunity to repurpose that content and get it out there to additional audiences that might not have been reached initially. My slides, look at my slides. They're very simplistic. You've probably noticed that. A simple little text phrase at the top that tells you what I'm going to talk about, a quick picture that you can kind of latch on to that gives you some support for what I'm talking about, and then you listen to me give the information. You're not reading through bullet points on the slide. One thing this does is makes it easier to concentrate on my voice. A second thing it does is make me have to move slides more frequently because it's one quick topic per slide right there in the title. But the third thing it does is it makes it really easy to repurpose this content. If I want these slides translated, I throw them to a translation agency and they just change the titles. And I know that they're not messing up any wrapping in the slide itself, inside of graphics. I know that they're not messing up animations and builds that I have. It makes it so simple to repurpose the content effectively. And while I'm thinking about translating things, I'm not just thinking about languages, and this is where cultures come back in. I look out for cultural assumptions. If I make a presentation to American audiences, I can use Uncle Sam and use him as a stand-in for this idea of a call to action. I want you. It's built into our cultural background. But people in other countries, even if they know about Uncle Sam, wouldn't feel that same affinity. So I did this. I had a webinar where I was presenting to a UK audience, and I asked the person I was coordinating with in the UK, is there anybody that's the same kind of thing that would say, I want you, maybe a recruiting poster? And they said, oh, yeah, you're talking about Lord Kitchener. Well, I had never heard of Lord Kitchener, but I looked him up on the web, and there he was, and it's perfect. It's the exact image that I want. It gives the same content. So watch out for cultural assumptions you're making. And by the way, this can even be true within your same geography. If I say, where's the beef, and put that into a presentation, people over a certain age, that means something to. But people under a certain age might not know what I'm referring to, an old ad campaign that was picked up and popularized for a while. So you want to be careful about assumptions of what people are going to recognize and feel an affinity to. Now, all this talk about translating and doing all this work might sound like it's too much for you to do, especially if you're in a small organization. You don't have a big multilingual staff. You don't have the time to work on all of this. It turns out that it's actually very easy to use outside agencies. They exist. You just do a simple Google search. I'm not going to promote any specific companies, but just look for ways to do transcription and translation. You start with your recording that you made of your initial webinar. You create an audio-only version of it. You've got a nice little MP3 file. Send that file to a transcription agency. They've got a team of people that listen on headphones, and they write it out, and now you've got a full written version of what you said in that webinar. You take that written version, you send it to a translation agency. Boom, they sit there and translate it for you. It doesn't cost nearly as much as you might be afraid it does. Those are really reasonable services. Now you have a translated written version. Maybe you have them translate your slides as well, which are easy because they're set up to be multicultural and easy to translate. Now you've got a choice. Do you take that translated transcript and have a new speaker in that language record it, and you overlay the recording on top of your translated slides? Boom, you've got an entire recording ready to go, ready to use for your alternate audience. If that's too much work, if you can't find a voiceover person to do the narration, then you take that translated transcript, copy a couple of your slide images in, boom, you make a white paper out of it, and you hand that out and make it available as content for your secondary audience. Either way, you're getting an extended reach out to people that couldn't get that easily any other way. Now, Dallas, I'm going to move straight on to our next section and keep a couple of these questions for our Q&A because I want to make sure I get through a lot of content and really make this power-packed for everybody.
I totally agree with that.
Okay. If you're thinking about webinar recordings, that's usually a straight archive of the full live session from the time you started talking to the time you ended talking. But that's going to include a lot of stuff that was only useful for your live audience. You had pauses for interactive exercises like polls. You maybe reference upcoming webinars or upcoming conferences or special offers that are time limited. Those made sense in the live presentation, but would they make sense in a recorded on-demand presentation people could be listening to 3 months later? It makes sense to edit that recording, cut things down so to get rid of the things that don't apply to your on-demand audiences. The other thing you're looking for is an opportunity to break that long format presentation into shorter, more easily digestible segments. A viewer might not want to commit to watching a 50-minute recording in the hopes that they're going to find some little portion of interest in there. but they would be inclined to take a chance on a 5-minute recording that's very clearly labeled, this covers one specific topic area, one specific tip. How do you do that? Gee, if you haven't seen an example of that in this presentation, I'm just not working properly. You view the structure of your content. Your presentation is a collection of shorter subtopics. You make each of them have value as standalone content pieces after your webinar is over. So you can use section title slides to clearly break the flow into discrete topic areas. You end each topic section very definitively, and then you move on to a new topic area and start it out. By the way, you can do that kind of editing all the way down to a single soundbite. A quick tip, a quick piece of advice works great if you happen to be on webcam. If you've got a speaker on camera, you just cut them right down to one little piece of advice. People aren't looking at that static framed image of a head on webcam for 50 minutes, but they're really willing to look at it for 30 seconds. And that gives you something you can use going forward. When I talk about something you can use, this is coming back to this idea of how many pieces, how many assets can be useful. It's great if you have a lot of these short, focused topics, sub-recordings. You can create a library of content that you can use in different content marketing campaigns. And it gives you a library of knowledge that you can point to as an example of your subject expertise as an individual or as a business. What else does it give you? The opportunity to track which of those subtopics is the most popular, which have positive feedback, which are getting you questions from people. That tells you which ones you should be promoting more specifically and what things you should bring to your audiences in the future. This is information you cannot get when you're just looking at people viewing a 50-minute, 60-minute presentation. You don't know which piece of it was really exciting and interesting to them. Now, when we talk about having a lot of different content, short excerpts taken from your webinars, you don't just want to bury those on a resources page 3 levels down in your website's hierarchy. Those each have applications in marketing, in business communications. And I'm going to go through specific examples to get you thinking in the right direction. You'll probably come up with other things you can do. This is not a comprehensive list, but I hope it's a good brainstorming exercise and gives you a way to think about using all of this content that you're creating. First, of course, is sales and marketing communications. We're always looking for a reason to contact our prospects. And being altruistic, saying, here's a piece of content that could be valuable for you, is a great reason to contact people. It makes them think of your company, have a perception of you as providing value, instead of just a company that keeps saying, buy from me, buy from me, buy from me, over and over solicitations. Don't overlook the addition of a quick playback link just in a signature block on emails. You can pass that out to your sales force, who are always sending out emails to prospects, to your marketing people, and say, just put this link into your signature block, and I'll give you a different one you can switch to next week. That's a great tool. You could even put that into their extended absence messages. If you're going to go on vacation, don't just say, you can't reach me, sorry. Say, but while I'm gone, you might like to look over this piece of information, some value for you. So it's a way to give people a way to continue to get value from your company and keep making that value different. Same thing applies to your home page, your website. A static home page is a boring home page. It doesn't ever change. Why should I come back there again? But if your home page is being updated all the time with new content, it gives people a reason to keep coming back and visiting your company. See what's new. How do you get that new content? Lots of little excerpt recordings, subtopics. Here's something that you might find interesting this week, a new reason for you to come back and check what's going on. Not buried in a page full of past recordings, but right there on the home page. You can use it in newsletters and blogs, your own and other ones, from partners, from other people who cover your industry. You put a topic snippet in as a news item, and then you can expand the discussion around a tip that's made in your recording as a new column or an article or a blog post. I did that on the BrightTALK site, and I did it on my site for this webinar. I talked about some things I was going to talk about in the webinar, and then I expanded on them. Things I won't have time to drill into in detail in the webinar. Let's talk about it some more in this post, and you can get some additional information. I'd love to hear from you if you saw one of those posts and that helped influence your decision to come to the live event itself, or maybe to come to the recording and watch that. It's a great thing to find out. What haven't I mentioned so far? Social media, you're waiting for that. I guess it goes without saying. You're always looking for things you can put on your Facebook page, new updates. Well, new content pieces give you that. Put it on LinkedIn. I get a lot of action through LinkedIn, more than my Facebook page. And Twitter, you can put out announcements about new content pieces now available. And it's always great to have additional content that you can use. Something you might not be thinking about is search engine advertising. That's pay-per-click, sponsored ads. If your company does some of that, you probably send people to your homepage all the time. Well, how about expanding that? Instead of just saying, if you click on this ad, you'll go to our generic website, and then you have to figure out what to do next, send people directly to a value proposition, a piece of content. Here's a tip. Here's some useful information on the subject you were just searching on. And then when you're done watching that, you can forward to the website and find out more. It's going to have a lot more power. In the same way, you've got webinar promotions. Looking for the next upcoming webinar, you might want to check out a tip that we gave from a previous webinar. What's the kind of things you can learn? This is a great place, by the way, to use one of those quick little 30-second sound bites and just put it on your landing page that talk about the kinds of things that you give as value in your webinar. And then there's syndication sites. I've got YouTube as an example here. Vimeo would be another one. Get your information up there on generic content availability libraries. Make sure that you don't just upload it by itself. You give it a descriptive narrative. You put keywords on it so that your recordings are going to be indexed and found in search queries. And then you want to take advantage of specialized communities as well. What do I mean by that? If I use BrightTALK as an example, they have libraries that are subdivided by area of interest. So I'll bet that this recording is going to end up on the marketing channel as a way that people can find information that's related to marketing content. So get it up there to channels, to specific subgroups of people who are going to be interested in just that piece of information. Dallas, I'm going to keep moving solidly forward so that I can get through my prepared content and get into Q&A as quickly as we can.
No problem. Go ahead.
Let's talk about a very specific, specialized way of getting some additional return after a webinar. And in this case, it's immediately after a webinar. This is what I call teasing a demo, and it does not work for every business. It does not work for every webinar you do. But if it works in your particular case, you'll find it really, really effective. And the best way for me to talk about it is through examples. What you're going to do is do a webinar that's very generic, very altruistic. It just talks about advice and best practices. And then you follow that up with the ability to get an additional demo. I've used this in many cases myself in the past. Let's say your company makes software. In this example, you make software for day traders on the stock market. You give a webinar on day trading tips for new stock market investors, and you're talking all about generic things: how to identify good candidates for investment, how you track performance, how to look for volatility, how do you react to market swings. At the end of the webinar, you say, oh, by the way, we happen to be using our company's software to show up all of this, all these activities. I didn't want to make this a sales pitch, but if you're intrigued, if you're interested in seeing how the software works, how does it do all of those things you just saw, we have a demo where you can ask a lot of questions about how the software works. Or if you have a physical product, same type of thing. We're giving a webinar on the impact of new postal regulations on the corporate mailroom. So we're going to tell you how to deal with the new things that are coming out from the Postal Service on new pricing and new policies on international shipments, whatever it is. And you're going to have to update your systems. This is going to tell you good ways to do that, what to look out for. oh, by the way, we happen to be demonstrating all of that using this metering machine that our company makes. Would you like to find out how it works and how we did those changes? We're having a demo where you can ask specific questions about the machine itself. Now, I like offering that demo immediately after the webinar. Our webinar is scheduled from 1 to 2, and you don't announce there's going to be anything else. And then at 1:55, you say, hey, by the way, if you'd like to stay on the line and see a demo, we're going to do that right now, answer some additional questions. Or you can click on this link and go into the separate room for it. Some people will be frustrated by that, and they're going to tell you, hey, I don't have the time for that. I wanted to see this, but I can't make it. I've got another meeting. Fantastic. Now you've got something to turn over to a salesperson as a qualified lead who is interested in your product, and they have a reason to contact them and say, sorry you couldn't make the demo that we had. I would love to answer your questions and make sure you get everything that you wanted. What's the biggest obstacle in achieving return on your webinars after the live date? I would say it's inertia. We're all busy. It's easy to think about a webinar as a one-shot assignment. You check that off your task list so you can move on to your next project. But ROI, think about ROI. It's not just 3 random letters. It's a return on investment, which means if you want greater returns, sometimes you need to put a little more investment in terms of time, in terms of effort. We talked about a lot of different approaches to building value for your audiences and building value for your company after your presentation of a live webinar. You're not going to use every technique for every webinar. You consider what's the ongoing usefulness of the information that was presented. What's the perceived value of that information to your prospects? How much time, money, and effort can you afford to dedicate to follow-on activities? That's going to tell you what you should do. And then don't get overwhelmed by what I put in here. You can have an incremental approach to getting more returns. Start with just better tracking and analysis. If you answered that you don't do this very often and track how many people are viewing your recordings, get better reports on that. Figure out which ones are evergreen, which ones you should promote more to keep them in the public's eye. Pick one recording to highlight. See what kind of response you get on just promoting that one instead of a library. Look to some of the other ideas I presented. Figure out, is this one so valuable, is this one so popular with my initial language audience that I should try translating it and getting it to a secondary audience? Only you can decide which methods are going to give you the greatest bang for your buck. And that's what's going to make life work for you. And I always finish up my webinars by saying, you are not on my list. The fact that you attended this does not mean that I'm going to contact you in any way, but I do respond to emails personally. I'm a real human being. So if you want to find out more, if you've got a question, send it to me at an email address there, kmolay@wsuccess.com, and I will send you a response. And with that, Dallas, let's do some more questions. I know we've got a lot.
Wonderful. I'm thinking about the real human being. You know, probably in 20 years from now, we'll have robots giving webinars at some point,
exactly.
Which will be crazy. We joke about it now, but you never know what's going to happen. But yeah, so there's definitely a lot of great questions. I want to quickly, for anyone who's on the line, BrightTALK, as Ken said, is a webinar content marketing platform where we connect you with professionals around the world. So we'd be happy to talk to you offline about your video and webinar programs. If you look in the attachments, there's our marketing solutions, or you can contact me directly at djessup, Jessup, at BrightTALK. So let's jump into those questions. So Ben wants to know, do you find that a webinar that's half an hour long works better, worse, or the same as a webinar that is, a full hour in terms of live attendance?
People have gotten very used to 1-hour webinars, and we tend to just knee-jerk say, okay, we're going to have an hour-long webinar. It's easy to put on a calendar. Half an hour total is nice sometimes when it's really directed and focused. We're doing one today that's advertised as 45 minutes, which is a nice break point. It still gives people 15 minutes to get a new cup of coffee and prepare their materials before the next session. Play with it. See what works for you. It's the same answer in everything you ever do in marketing. Test, verify, and analyze, and then see what works with your audiences and your content. I can't give you a generic answer, but definitely try. getting out of the standard 1-hour webinar mode.
I certainly would agree with that. We have over 50,000 webinars and videos on BrightTALK, and we definitely find that, average viewing time is about 37 minutes, but that, definitely on-demand people, as you said, definitely repurposing the content into smaller bits will help them digest it better. Definitely live, gets that engagement because you're speaking directly to the expert. So certainly we're seeing people are still spending time with webinars because they get this, almost one-to-one interaction with the speaker. However, I think as you said, that 45-minute is really the sweet spot. If you get through about 30 to 35 minutes of content and then get about a 10-minute Q&A, it's just the amount of right time. You're not stretching and fluffing the content, but you're still able to kind of digest and really spend time and nurture your audience. So definitely some great advice there. The next question goes back to, I think you had a lot of questions around this office hour Q&A follow-up that came through. So another one was around, how successful are they? It seems as though people wouldn't want to block off another hour just to sit through, listening to people's questions with no additional content. What are kind of your best practices here?
Oh, yeah. You have to know your audiences. It's going to be woefully awful for executives and business managers. It's great for technical audiences. If you are presenting material to engineers, you can really make hay out of those kinds of additional question things where people want to drill in. It's just as I mentioned before, you're going to find out what your audiences respond to, but don't cut that one out as something that's never going to work, because I have seen them be very successful.
Great. So moving on to, I think, kind of the engagement portion of what you were talking about is, and this still goes back to the Q&A section, is, what if you don't get a lot of questions? Of course, you can plant seed questions, but what are some of your best suggestions to raise engagement if no one's really participating?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's not our problem today. Dallas hasn't had to use any seed questions. I'm looking at all these actual questions that she's asking me in the queue. But if nobody's asking, what you do is stay away from the kind of slides that I'm showing you right now. Are there any questions? Anybody have a question out there? Next question from anyone? Instead, make your own question. What do you think is the most important thing that I covered today that you'd like to hear a little more about? So you give people something very specific to respond to. Say, what's your number one question about this product area? What's the number one thing you've run into as a problem in the past? And now you give people a way to think about a specific rather than a generic, I wonder if I have a question. That's your best way at getting additional interaction when people are being slow to help out. Great.
So jumping back a little bit to more of the, as we said, cultural language, geo, however you wish to look at it. We have a couple questions around that, just, thinking around one of our audience members works at a global company, wanting to know, is it better to translate a single webinar into multiple languages or to pick our, top secondary language and then just duplicate, kind of transcribe and all that for the rest of those webinars? We run them fairly frequently, so it's hard to cover all of our languages. It looks like they cover 4 of them for every webinar.
Yeah, I hate to do this. It keeps coming back to bang for the buck. If your potential returns from that additional audience segment is likely to be high enough to make it worth your while, then you should do it. Whether it's staging another webinar, a live one in the secondary language, whether it's providing some kind of simultaneous interpretation. It's actually my least favorite way of doing a webinar. I would rather have a webinar that's dedicated entirely to all materials, all language being in one language at a time, or whether it's producing those additional assets and resources that you make available to those additional audiences after the fact is going to be a decision that you can only make based on how much money can we get from those darn people, or how much involvement in our organization, whatever it is you're trying to achieve as your business objective. It can work very well. You're not going to do it for every webinar you put on, especially if you do a lot of them. As you said, it's just not worth the time investment in it, but definitely pick a few of them to make yourself more attractive and seem more responsive to those audiences that you want to get involved in your business.
Great. So We have a couple questions going around product webinars and sales webinars, so I'll try to combine these two because I think they have some great points together. So essentially, if your webinar is a sales webinar and there's a sales pitch at the end, would you send out the full recording or cut off the sales pitch and include some sort of call to action in conjunction? How do you feel about product-driven webinars? Do you see that the content performance suffers extremely when it's too focused on a product?
A webinar can do well. Product focus, even making a direct sales pitch. There's no reason to stay away from those. What you want to do is make sure that the expectations of the people who are coming to it is that that's what's going to happen. If that's what they expect, that's what they should get. So don't be coy about it. Don't say you're going to learn tips and best practices and advice and get education and then sit there and say, now that you're here, I'd like to sell you a course. I'd like to sell you a product. That's not why they showed up. If you tell them this is your opportunity to learn about a product that you might not know about, to see why it's valuable, to see how you can apply it, that's the people who show up. And then if you don't give them that product pitch, they're going to be disappointed. So just make sure that you're setting your expectations in the promotion, in the marketing that you're doing, and that that's what you're delivering. If you do that, you can always give any kind of presentation, and hopefully you'll have a few of each sprinkled into your mix. You spend some time on tips, tricks, education, and you spend some time on information about our offerings. And there's an audience for both of those. You don't have to pick one or the other. Just don't mix and match. Don't leave it as a surprise for your audience members who show up.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. I think that goes back to one of our earlier questions around content performance, engagement, and segmentation, is that folks who are getting a sales conversation or a product-driven webinar should have already engaged with your company and your brand multiple times. So they're prepared for a product, they know what they're going into, and they're prepared for it. If folks are joining because they want to, great, but you can't, it's terrible to trick someone into joining for a product-driven webinar if they're not prepared for it. And then you'll definitely see the disengagement, which is what you're not looking for. One of our customers, Uberflip, I absolutely love what they do. So what they do is they do their educational content, they do the Q&A, and they tell everyone on the line at the very beginning, after the Q&A, we'll be hosting a live demo. Now that gives it in live, they've already got their attention, and the folks who just wanted the content and the Q&A can leave, and those who want to engage with the demo can do it right then. So you can either do it that way, or as Ken said, certainly you can follow up with a different presentation or send them within the marketing materials for the webinar saying, would you like a follow-up demo of this product? So there's a lot of ways to do it. As Ken and I have mentioned, though, making sure that it's not tricked into it, and definitely that it's on their own accord will make sure that, they convert a lot better. So, and then I wanted to jump back to some of your content, Ken, throughout the presentation. I just really loved it. I want to make sure you got through it. Is that, I think there's a lot about the embedding the content on your site. So one of the things that we do at BrightTALK is specifically, and, I'm sure with, depending on your webinar platform, you can do that as well. But with us specifically is what we've been doing is embedding the webinar on our blog posts. So like the blog post for this webinar and several of our others, what we've been doing is embedding the actual webinar in the post so that while people are engaging with the blog, they can easily watch the recording or register for it. So it's kind of a multi-purpose registration and viewing after the live event. So it's a great way to kind of repurpose that and make it easy for the audience to engage with it. And we've seen a lot of success with that. And then I just want to call out one attachment is a webinar spotlight that you talked about with repurposing small segments. So that's something that we do here at BrightTALK is webinar spotlights, where we take a huge, 1 to 3 minute section of your presentation and put it into a short snippet. That's kind of not quite a podcast. It's definitely shorter than that, but it repurposes, the creme de la creme from your presentation. So there's a lot of great things there. So I'm just doubling back on some of your great tips, Ken. So let's jump back into a couple more questions. I want to be cognizant so people can jump to their next meeting or to lunch, depending on where you're dialing in from. So I think this is an interesting question because you didn't really talk about this much, but I think it's definitely something that I think about as well is, what role do partners or your customers play in post-live event promotion? Most of our agreements really only talk about leading up to the live event. What's appropriate? Is there room to leverage this as well?
Oh, there's a huge room to leverage that with your channels, with your partners, with anybody else who's involved with you. If you give them content, everybody's looking for content these days. And if you can create content, you become incredibly valuable. And people love that. So you say, here's some advice. Here's a sound clip you can use. Here's a short recording from a webinar that we did, and you can play that out to your channels. You can give that to some of your customers, to some of the people you're trying to reach, and give you a reason to contact them. It's the same things that applied, what I was talking about on your own promotional channels, whether it's newsletters, whether it's blogs, whether it's Facebook updates, whether it's anything else that you're going to do to reach people. They're trying to do the same thing. And if you supply them with something they can use, they will love you forever, and they will. It's a mutual win relationship. They're going to get better returns for themselves, and it's going to reflect back to you and give you something that you're seen as a good content provider. So everything that I mentioned in this presentation, you should make available to your channels.
Perfect. And then I'll combine these two questions to be our last question, and we'll follow up with everyone else offline because I know we're running over. But essentially, I think there's a lot of question around the right timing post live event. So we have a question around, what's the lifespan of webinar content? When does it become outdated? As well as, is there a right time frame to tweet and post out a webinar after the live date? So essentially, I think this is kind of a evergreen versus timely question on around how long it's worth promoting afterwards.
Yeah, how high is up? That's why you do the tracking. If you're tracking and performance drifts off and tails down, it tells you that the useful lifespan is going away. Sometimes all it means is you need to do another promotion and make people aware of it again. Obviously, there are some types of content that have a very specific lifespan. If you're talking about new regulations, new policies, new things that relate to changes in the infrastructure, then those are only valid while those changes are taking place. And the next time something changes, you need new content to go with it. So you get rid of the old stuff. But you're going to track, you're going to see which are the pieces that continue to provide returns over time. And when they stop, you get rid of them or you stop promoting them and you move on to new content.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Ken, and thank you to all of our audience members who joined us today. As I said at the very beginning, this will be available on demand on the URL you're currently on, so feel free to watch it again. I know there's a couple questions about the slides. We're not sharing the slides today. As Ken said, they're very they're supposed to enhance the presentation, not be the presentation. But we do have the brief attached in the documents, which actually has this information plus more. So I'd highly recommend reading that. I know we have some ratings already coming through of people who are already going to plan to use some of these ideas right away. So we're always glad to hear that. And definitely, if you have any questions for us or Ken, feel free to reach out, and we'd love to help you, with your webinar and video program if you need it. So thank you guys for joining us today, and have a wonderful Tuesday.